Hello, I'm Nathan Martin with the Divine Pollination Hive and the UnityProcess.com. In today's video, we're going to discuss intellectual character trait number 3 out of 8, intellectual empathy. The first two traits, intellectual humility and intellectual courage, were discussed in a previous video. If you're interested in learning more about intellectual empathy and how to be an empathetic person, please stay tuned. Intellectual empathy. It's having a consciousness of the need to imaginatively put oneself in the place of others in order to genuinely understand them, which requires the consciousness of our egocentric tendency to identify truth with our immediate perceptions of long-standing thought or belief. This trait correlates with the ability to reconstruct accurately the viewpoints and reasoning of others, and to reason from premises, assumptions, and ideas other than our own. This trait also correlates with a willingness to remember occasions when we were wrong in the past despite an intense conviction that we were right, and with the ability to imagine our being similarly deceived in the case at hand. So intellectual empathy is something that, first of all, you're just not born with it. It's something you have to actually develop. You have to really kind of go out of your way. You need humility, and second, you need courage before you can even start looking at other people's viewpoints. Because if you don't have the humility to know that you don't know it all and that you can be biased, and if you don't have the courage to look at often difficult concepts that might emotionally trigger you, or be a concept that you don't believe in, that is against maybe some of your religious beliefs or some other kind of conviction, then you're not even going to get to the point where you can be an empathetic person. John Stuart Mill alluded to this in his book On Liberty, when he said, "He who knows only his own side of the case or argument knows little of that. His reasons may be good, and no one may have been able to refute them. But if he is equally unable to refute the reasons on the opposite side, if he does not so much as know what they are, he has no ground for preferring either option." So you can see how empathy is very important. We need to go into and reason and understand the viewpoints of others so that we can better understand our own position. Because if we have no contrary positions, then it really devalues our own position because it loses meaning, it loses purpose. What value is my position if there is no other positions from which contrast and offer contrast? And often we're able to even find meaning and discover meaning through what's called intellectual synthesis, where we have the thesis or the problem, then somebody reacts to that problem, and they have the antithesis, they come to with that, and then we work through it with them, and then we find a synthesis. We come to a higher purpose, higher understanding, higher meaning through practicing intellectual empathy. As I mentioned, intellectual humility and courage underlie intellectual empathy, for without the consciousness to realize the limits of one's own knowledge and understanding, as well as an awareness of one's capacity for bias, and without the courage necessary to face difficult viewpoints, insights, and ideas that may challenge your preconceived and often emotionally charged beliefs, we're unable to even begin the process of empathetically entering into the viewpoints of others. So there's a really good book that I read a long time ago. It was a good 20 years ago when I was going through my divorce. It's called The Power of Empathy, and it really made a big impact on me because I realized that I was not as empathetic as I could be, and that I could start becoming a more empathetic person. And so in the book Power of Empathy, he says, "We don't know enough to make judgments." That statement embodies the heart and soul of empathy. The core of empathy is understanding, and understanding always precedes explanation in the effort to understand. Empathy asks questions and refuses quick answers. "I don't know" is one of empathy's most powerful statements. From that admission of not having all the answers, empathy starts searching for ways to expand the picture in order to develop a broader understanding. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, but that's from the book The Power of Empathy. I have that linked below if you are interested in checking out that book. So one of the things that I really appreciate is that, we go into a situation, instead of just kind of going in guns blazing like you see in television shows all the time, where you shoot first, you ask questions later. You make accusations first, you ask questions later. And with empathy, you are actually withholding judgment. You are not coming to any conclusions, and you are going to ask the other person as many questions as possible to try to understand. Now, the problem with this is we've been conditioned to believe that questions are like an interrogation. So if I'm asking you questions, it's not because I'm empathetic, it's because I want to prove that you were bad and then I want to grill you for it. But if you can withhold your judgmentalness, if you can pull back that energy of, or it's like if you're asking questions and you're already in your judgment, you're already in your conclusion, it's going to be much different than if you're asking questions before making a judgment, before coming to a conclusion. Because judgments aren't bad. It's what's called a reasoned judgment, but you have to get enough reasoning. You have to ask enough questions before making the judgment. And so what we need to do with that is we start asking questions. We're like, I don't know. And I'm going to start asking questions so that I can expand the picture, so that I can develop a broader understanding, and then I can come to a conclusion. So for example, in the book, he gives an example of his father going into the principal's office when he was in trouble. So he got in trouble. His father went to the school, and the father, instead of just, yelling at the son or yelling at the principal, he just began to ask the principal questions. And he was asking questions in a very emotionally balanced, even way until he got enough information. And once he got enough information, he understood that there was some kind of an axe to grind that the principal had, and that it was no fault of his son. So he didn't just bow to authority and jump his son, but he also didn't just protect his son and jump on the principal. He asked questions, enough questions to come to a judgment, and then he made his decision, and then he told the principal where he could go, basically. Empathy versus sympathy. And I think this is a very, very important part to really discuss when you're talking about empathy and what it is. Empathy, if you look at the etymology, it's en pathos, which is in feeling. So you're going into the feeling. And with sympathy, it's syn pathos, or together in the feeling. So with sympathy, you are feeling the feeling together with somebody. You feel it, they feel it. There is kind of an enmeshed quality about it. You have experienced this before. You understand it from the point of view that it also triggers you. It makes you emotionally upset. You're feeling this thing that they're feeling. So you are actually enmeshed. It's really not a good thing. It's codependency. It's psychological enmeshment. But with empathy, where you go into the feeling, you're acknowledging that you don't know what they are feeling. You don't understand it. And so then you're going to start asking enough questions so that you can enter into the feeling and understand it. So empathy is going into the feeling to understand it, where sympathy is with the feeling and understands it more from an enmeshed quality and an enmeshed perspective. So there's a thing where people talk about, oh, I'm an empath. And you hear this a lot, especially among New Age. But really what I think they've done is they've created a rationalization. And in this rationalization, they've really confused empaths with sympaths. So they've confused empathy with sympathy. So this is from an article called The Original Signs You're an Empath. And this just kind of gives an example of, I don't actually believe this stuff, but this is an example of what people believe about empaths, especially if you're kind of new agey or something like that. So from this article, it says, what is a true empath? A true empath, we're talking about someone who is empathic, not just empathetic, can literally feel what others are feeling. So here's some signs. In public spaces, you feel overwhelmed with inexplicable emotions. 2, you physically experience other people's physical ailments. 3, you feel overwhelmed and incapacitated when watching something horrible, even if it's only on television. 4, you always know what someone really means, even when they're lying. 5, you feel compelled to care for anyone in pain, no matter who they are or what they've done to you. 6, people open up to you, even if you don't want them to. And 7, you have a calming, soothing, restorative effect on people. You might even be able to heal them. Now, I think that this is sympathy because this is all enmeshed. This is actually a sign that somebody doesn't have boundaries. They don't have good boundaries. Now, you can be empathetic. You can be very extremely sensitive, but that doesn't mean that you are now being stuck, and enmeshed in their feelings and feeling everything that they're feeling. This is sympathy again. This is with the emotion. If you remember that sympathy is where you're with the emotion, you're meshed. So empathy, sympathy, and boundaries. A personal boundary is a property line around you. It delineates what is and is not your responsibility in relationship to those around you. It does not tell others what to do. It merely tells them what you will and will not do based on what is and is not your responsibility. So for example, if somebody comes to you with a problem, like a child says, hey, Dad, I have a problem. You go, okay, well, what is your problem? They tell you the problem. Now, if you are overwhelmed and you're taking that on, you're in sympathy. You have no boundaries. You are actually taking the responsibility for your child. Now, if your child tells you that and then you stop, you ask questions, you help them to better understand the situation as you better understand the situation. You don't solve it for them because you're realizing what is your responsibility, what's not your responsibility. This is their child's responsibility to figure out, not your responsibility. You're not just some, candy store in the sky that is going to help them solve their problem. You are an advisor, but you are not a fixer. You are not in sympathy because you're not enmeshed. You are merely asking them enough questions so that they can come to a conclusion on their own and figure it out. So in this way, you're training them to be more empathetic by modeling empathy and through asking them good questions. And you recognize whose responsibility is what. You know what your responsibility is. You know what your responsibility is not. And so you're not going to go into that feeling with them. So everything that you just saw in the previous slide, these signs of an empath, what they really are is signs of a sympath, somebody who is psychologically enmeshed with others and does not know what their responsibility is and is not in relationship to others. But as we process our emotional upsets, as we go within and we work through and we create what's called emotional intelligence, we are removing ourselves, we're psychologically healing ourselves and detaching ourselves from those around us so that they can start being more responsible for their lives and we can be more responsible for ours. It's very difficult if we're always trying to get people to be responsible for us in one sense, or if we're always taking responsibility for them in another. So our burden is going to be much lighter when we are just responsible for ourselves and not for other people. In the same way that we're actually helping them to be more responsible individuals when we let them figure out their own stuff, when we let them feel their own stuff. So we stop sympathizing and we move more and more and more into empathy because empathy is boundaried. Empathy has good boundaries. So next we have what's called the Trivium. And the Trivium is the first three of the liberal arts. It is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The Trivium was something that was taught all the way up to like 500 BC, and maybe even before that in Egypt. But it is something that is the qualities of a liberated mind. It's called the liberal arts because it is something that would liberate the mind. It would help you to break free from societal programming, conditioning, and mental slavery. Because as your mental state goes, so your body goes. If you are a mental slave, you are a physical slave. But if you are a mentally liberated individual, then you are also a physically liberated individual. Actions follow thought. So the Trivium goes grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And another way we could look at this is knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Where grammar has to do with, gaining enough knowledge. You're gaining the knowledge of the words, you're gaining knowledge of the syntax, you're collecting enough knowledge and information, input, so that you can then process it. So understanding processes. That's where you go into the logic. And then finally, when you go to convey it, now you're conveying your wisdom because you have gained enough knowledge, you've gained enough understanding, you've removed any contradictions between your knowledge and understanding, and now you can start talking about it, you can start speaking it, and this is wisdom. And also you can start acting upon it. Another way to look at that is also compassion. You can't really be compassionate unless you are truly understanding it and truly knowledgeable about it. And then the third part, there's questions associated with each phase, each stage. So when you're in the grammar and knowledge stage, you need to ask what, who, where, and when. And once you understand, what is the problem, what's going on, what is also a who, where, and when. Who is there? Where was this? Where did it take place? And when did it happen? And these are all very important data points and information points that we need when we start, using our thinking process. Then we need to start asking why, and why gives us understanding. Why is this happening? Why did this occur? Why do I want this? I'm trying to go into an action. This is what I want. Why do I want it? Now, how do I go about getting it? So the Trivium and reality generation. So in the Trivium, you have the grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And this corresponds to reality generation, where you have your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So thoughts, that kind of represents the knowledge. Feelings represents understanding and logic. And your behaviors represent the rhetoric. You are now acting upon its wisdom. You're acting out. Or in some cases, some people is folly. They're fools acting out foolish behavior. But whatever, because maybe they have poor thoughts, poor quality of thoughts, and poor quality of feelings, and now they are going into behaviors that are also of poor quality. So logic and empathy. Logic grants understanding by asking why questions. Empathy also grants understanding by asking why questions. There is an overlap. They're not the same thing, but they are intimately connected together, and they work hand in hand, and you're asking why for both. You're just it's just like a context thing. So if I'm, just trying to understand what's going on in a situation with a computer and I'm trying to technically fix it, it's going to be a little bit different than if I'm trying to ask a question of a person and trying to understand them. So you're either asking a question to a person, trying to understand them better, or even asking yourself. So it's going to be more about relationships, personal relationships with empathy. And logic is kind of more of an overarching thing, which can be used in more areas than empathy. But empathy is still very, very similar and overlaps and is encompassed within logic. So emotion and reason are complementary aspects of mind. So contrary to the whole Mr. Spock thing, where Mr. Spock is talking about how feelings don't make sense, feelings are illogical, so we got rid of feelings so that we could be like cold machines, and now we have a much better ascended society. Well, that's really not the case. That's a very common misconception. So let me go through this. This is from the book, The Miniature Guide to the Human Mind. That will be linked below. It is common to believe erroneously that emotion and reason often conflict with each other. Emotion and reason function independently of each other. I just discussed that. That it is possible to be an emotional person and hence do little reasoning. So I'm emotional, therefore I don't reason. It is possible to be a rational person and hence experience little emotion. So you have those computer Spock-like people. Yes, and here it goes. Rational persons are cold and mechanical like Mr. Spock, and emotional persons are lively, energetic, warm, but poor reasoners. So if you're a very emotional person and you're very, happy and energetic and warm, you're a poor reasoner. That is a misunderstanding. In these mistaken views, one must give up the possibility of a rich emotional life if one decides to become a rational person. And two, one must give up rationality if one is to live a passionate life. So this is what's called a false dichotomy or a false dilemma fallacy. These misunderstandings lead us to think of thought and emotion as if they were oil and water rather than inseparable functions of the mind. They lead us away from realizing the thinking underlying our emotions and the emotions that influence our thinking. So that means that we stop taking our intellect and putting it towards our emotions to try to understand ourselves better, because we see them as mutually exclusive, and you wouldn't actually use them together, so now they can't actually complement each other. And they lead us to think that there is nothing we can do to control our emotional life. Unless, of course, we are just, suppressing them like Spock would do. So these are misunderstandings. Emotional intelligence and critical thinking. So emotion is a state of consciousness. Emotional intelligence and critical thinking. Again, this is from the Miniature Guide to the Human Mind. Emotion, a state of consciousness having to do with the arousal of feelings. It refers to any of the personal reactions, pleasant or unpleasant, that one may have in a situation. Intelligence, the ability to learn or understand from experience or to respond successfully to new experiences. The ability to acquire and retain knowledge. It implies use of reason in solving problems and directing conduct effectively. Emotional intelligence, it's bringing said intelligence to bear upon your emotions, guiding emotions through high-quality reason. It implies that high-quality reasoning in a situation will lead to more satisfactory emotional states than low-quality reasoning. Critical thinking provides a link between intelligence and emotion. Critical thinking brings intelligence to bear upon our emotional life. It enables us to take command of our emotions. It enables us to make good judgments. And it provides us with a satisfactory emotional life. And so when you use critical thinking for your emotions, when you're turning your critical thinking, your intelligence inwards onto itself and working through your feelings and your thoughts, what you're doing is you're processing your emotional upsets. You're using what's called process. This is another function of logic. Logic processes things. And so now we are processing our emotional life. Essential idea, when our thinking is of high quality, rational emotions flow. When we develop rational emotions, we think reasonably. Rational emotions follow high quality thinking. And when we have rational emotions, we are also reasonable thinkers. So let's get into a little bit of a mystical take on empathy and rationality and reason and logic. And we'll look at this concept called the logos, which is looked at from lots of different people over time. Logos is a term in Western philosophy, psychology, rhetoric, and religion derived from Greek word meaning ground, plea, opinion, expectation, word, speech, account, reason or logic, proportion, and discourse. But it became a technical term in philosophy beginning with Heraclitus, who used the term for a principle of order and knowledge. Logos is the logic behind an argument. Logos tries to persuade an audience using logical arguments and supportive evidence. So rather than just having flowery rhetoric and using our emotional states to convince people of things and trying to persuade them, we're using evidence and logic to persuade instead. Logos is a persuasive technique often used in writing and rhetoric. So you can use it with rhetoric, but it's not just something that a lot of rhetoric is devoid of logos and logic. Ancient Greek philosophers used the term in different ways. The sophists used the term to mean discourse, and Aristotle applied the term to reasoned discourse, or the argument, in the field of rhetoric. The Stoic philosophers identified the term with a divine animating principle pervading the universe. This would be like the divine blueprint, the divine reason, the divine logic. Under Hellenistic Judaism, Philo developed the term into Jewish philosophy. The Gospel of John identifies the logos through which all things are made as divine, and further identifies Jesus Christ as the incarnate or the embodied logos. The term is also used in Sufism and the analytical psychology of Carl Jung. And I'd also like to say that the Gnostics, which gnosis means knowledge, the Gnostics were very much into this, and they also said that Jesus was the divine logos. He was the embodiment of reason. He was the embodiment of being a reasonable person. And a reasonable person also denotes empathy. Logocentrism is a term coined by the German philosopher Ludwig, I don't know how to pronounce that last name, in the 1920s. It refers to the tradition of Western science and philosophy that regards words and language as a fundamental expression of an external reality. It holds the logos as epistemologically superior in that there is an original, irreducible object which the logos represents. So logocentrism is very much synonymous with the Enlightenment period, enlightenment. It is, when you look at the Enlightenment period of, Sir Francis Bacon and a lot of the others, you have empiricism, you have the scientific method that came from that. You have inductive reasoning, you have abductive reasoning and these kinds of things. You have the works of John Locke and the philosophies around natural law. You have what in John Locke called it the law of reason. So logocentrism and what we call the Enlightenment period are very much the same. So when you are a logocentric individual, you very much are looking for the meaning within things. You're looking for meaning and purpose. You're not just, looking around and trying to eschew meaning and purpose. You're trying to go into things deeper and deeper and deeper via philosophy, via spirituality and stuff like that to understand things better. So if the logos is a spiritual thing, the logocentrism is like the philosophical counterpart to that. Jesus as the divine logos. In the beginning was the Word, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. John 1:1-3, and that was from the New King James Version. The Logos, being the divine blueprint of reason, this archetype of reason, of being a reasonable person, of fully embodying what it means to live a life of process. So I've heard it said that like the dark side and the light side. When you're a light side person, you are focused on the means, the process. You are a process-based individual, and you're not going to jump ahead past to a conclusion when you are really trying to find out what the truth is. So the truth becomes self-evident as a result of the process. But in like the dark side, when we are going more into the evil, into inversion, into Satanism, what we are doing is the ends justify the means. So you jump ahead to your conclusion and you reason from there. So one cannot understand what the Gospel of John was saying without having a grounded understanding, a reason purpose, of what the Logos means. The Logos is an ancient concept, one that the Gospel of John intimately understood and used to speak to its readers. Logocentrism is the meaning or the purpose or understanding found within our words. The Enlightenment period was mostly concerned with logocentrism, which is focusing on the value of reason, using it to give meaning in life, and conveying that meaning through words. It combines both the concept of sovereignty and magic within it, thus fulfilling the archetypes of the king and the priest that Jesus was said to be represented. The law of reason makes one sovereign, while being able to articulate the depth of meaning with words makes one a priest or a magician. Logocentrism greatly impacted Western society, which is what Marxism, deconstructionism, postmodernism, etc. are attempting to subvert. Logocentrism, aka Christ, is their enemy, and they will stop at nothing to undo the liberty that we've achieved as a result of it. So when you look at knowledge, logic, and wisdom, when we talked about the trivium earlier, you have a verse that comes to mind from the Bible. Jesus said, or the divine Logos answered, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." So if Jesus is the Logos and the Father represents wisdom or heaven, and no one gets to heaven but through him. Now, this means that we need to invite him into our heart. We need to accept Jesus into our heart. What is Jesus? We need to accept the divine reason. We need to accept Logos into our heart so that we can move from knowledge to build the bridge using logic and reason and empathy and get over to heaven, to wisdom, to the Father. So if we can do that, this is how we get to heaven. Logic is the bridge. Logos, reason. The law of reason is the bridge. It is logocentric. It is Jesus Christ. It is the reason having become flesh. Now, logic builds bridges. It builds bridges from knowledge to wisdom. And if we cross that bridge, that's how we get to heaven. Metaphorically, of course. That's how we create heaven. We live a life of process. We live a logocentric life focused on meaning, purpose. Logic, as I said, is a bridge, but it also is a bridge between people. This is what empathy does. So if you're asking people questions, you're trying to understand them better, you're going into the emotion, you're going into the feeling. You're like, I want to understand you better. Why did you feel this way? What did you do? Why did you feel this way? What was really going on here? I don't want to jump to a conclusion. And what happens is when we ask these questions to each other, we build bridges between each other. And these bridges are how we get to a better relationship. And in that case, heaven is this better relationship. You're actually building bridges of understanding because logic, empathy, creates understanding. You're building a bridge of understanding between people. So related concepts: understanding, logic, empathy, meaning, purpose, reason, process, why questions, causality, which is karma, so cause and effect is karma, rationale, rational, the logos, and power. Yes, so power is also there. When we are living a life of understanding and logic and empathy, we are actually gaining personal power because we're getting power through asking questions. Through gaining the understanding, we're gaining power. Not related. Rationalization, which is reasoning from a conclusion. So you have a presupposed conclusion. This is how you want things to be because this is how you think it's fair or whatever it might be. And now you're reasoning from a conclusion. You're trying to justify the conclusion, and you're going to come up with any manner of reasoning to justify it. And it's a very biased way of thinking. And all you're trying to do is confirm your biases. You're not letting reason take you to a conclusion. You're starting to reason from a conclusion and then try to come up with a reason why it's okay to believe what you believe or feel what you feel or do what you do. I mean, you can create a rationalization for just about anything, including murder and pedophilia and all kinds of things. That does not make it right. We know that when we align ourselves with the law of reason, then those things they're bad. We understand how harmful they are. Then you have what's called emotionally motivated reasoning. It is not related. Emotionally motivated reasoning is where you feel something and then you start acting on that, and you are creating reasons from this feeling. So you're like, I feel this, therefore it must be true. Or my intuition tells me, therefore it is true. Or whatever it is that you might come up with, some kind of, it's very connected to rationalization. But in this sense, it's like the middle stage. You think something or you feel something, and now from there you're creating all these reasons based from your feeling, and you're being very polarized. And you're not actually reasoning though. It's your emotions coming up with reasons. And one of the things with emotionally motivated reasoning, they have actually looked at a CAT scan of the brain, and the part of the brain that lights up is the rewards and punishment. And you're feeling the punishment part, when you're emotionally motivated. And then once you come up with a reason that like gives you an out from whatever this bad feeling is, all of a sudden you get a reward. So now you're rewarding yourself. So you start with punishment, then you reward yourself to get out of that punishment. And it's like this high. It's like, oh, I just got this dopamine high, or whatever kind of hormone is released into the brain that gives you this good feeling of winning or whatever it might be. But this is emotionally motivated reasoning. You're not reasoning from the place in the brain that actually deals with reason. You're reasoning from the brain, the part of the brain that is dealing with pain, suffering, and rewards. And then, of course, you have sympathy, which we discussed earlier, and how that is psychologically enmeshed. And psychologically enmeshed people are sympathizing. They are lacking boundaries, because enmeshment is having poor boundaries. They don't know what is their responsibility. They don't know what is not their responsibility. They're psychologically enmeshed, and they are in sympathy. And this is not a related concept. The Antichrist, or the anti-logos. Deconstructionism, a Marxist proxy, calls polarity pairs binaries. And they wrongly classify all so-called binaries as the wanted-unwanted variety. So, for example, you have men and women, and that's a binary, but everything's unwanted, wanted. So if I go through a bad experience and I don't like that, then I say, well, I'm going to get more clear on that. I'm going to find the meaning and the purpose in this bad experience. Like say death in life, a friend dies, prematurely. And now I have to go through this experience, and I have to find meaning from this experience. And so death is the unwanted in this case, and then life is the wanted. And from that binary, you find meaning. What they're saying is that all binaries are wanted, unwanted, victimizer, victimized. So if somebody died, they must have been victimized in that way. This is why feminism hates men, because obviously there's a binary there. One of them must have been the privileged class, and one must have been the one that was victimized. And so it must have been men that were victimizing, and the women were the victimized, and now they're taking their power back. So they erroneously believe that the wanted binary must have somehow victimized the unwanted binary, which is how they think it became the unwanted class in the first place. And this makes things such as male-female and oppositional rather than co-creative. So male and female are supposed to create things together, but now they're oppositional. From there, deconstructionism tries to make things fair between the wanted and unwanted binary by erasing binaries altogether through confusing and blurring the lines between the distinctiveness of each polarity. In the end, the intentional confusion, lack of clarity, and removal of distinctiveness between the binaries neuters one's ability to discover meaning and purpose, or the logos, from the various types of contrast we're provided in our lives. If polarities and dualities help us to discover and create meaning in our lives, where the process of such discovery is termed logocentric or Christ-centric, then Marxism and its proxies are the anti-logos, or literally the anti-Christ, because they're trying to blur the lines between all these different polarities, these binaries, whether they're a wanted, unwanted duality, or whether they're a co-creative polarity, like north and south, answers and questions, east and west, male and female. All these things are not oppositional, they're co-creative. So in conclusion, empathy and logic are intimately tied together, and they cannot function without the other. An empathetic person is rational, and a rational person is empathetic. Intelligence and emotional intelligence go hand in hand to leading a balanced, reasonable life. If we want to become more empathetic, we're really going to have to turn our reasoning inwards. We're going to have to take our intelligence and point it at our emotions so that we can then build emotional intelligence. This is going to help us to slow down, to stop making conclusions, and first go into the process and ask enough questions. And once we process, once we really gain enough understanding, then we're going to be able to start making conclusions that are reasonable, and we're going to act in a reasonable way. And we're going to act in a boundaried way too, because we're going to have better boundaries, because we're going to know where we begin and where we end, and where our responsibility begins and ends in relationship to those around us. If you enjoyed this video, please click like. If you'd like to stay up to date with my videos, please subscribe. If you would like to be notified via email whenever I release a new video, please click the bell next to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, or would like to go into a dialogue about this topic, please leave them in the comments section below. I'm Nathan Martin with the Divine Pollination Hive and the UnityProcess.com. Be safe, be sovereign, be well.